Everybody, thanks for watching and thanks for taking the time to purchase and support. And welcome to Ancient History Volume 3. So now, if you've been paying attention, you've seen the first two volumes, of course, by now, you see how this is going. We basically taking it from where the Egyptians was, conquered, and you had the empire taken over by the Greeks and everything that transpired after that. Because when you start looking at history, everything takes place after the fall of Kemet. We see the rise of the European powers. We see the Renaissance and everything like that leading up to, what we know today. But this is where they established this faulty history, and it's biblical, the so-called biblical history that is false. So when you go back into antiquity and you can start tracing from the time when the Egyptian empire fell, what the Greeks was doing and what these people they are talking about in the Middle East, in Egypt or what have you, what was going on with the so-called Jews, the Greeks and the Romans and everything that was happening with the wars of the Diadochi and everything like that. What took place? Because it's in this time that we can uncover the truth. It's in this time that we can see exactly what took place and how they was able to, push in this history. And that's exactly what they did. You have the truth and you have this history that they made up. And what they did was, as I showed you guys, they basically piggybacked off of real Greek history and been able to basically show what the Greeks was doing in the wars of the Greeks, that, there's actual proof of these wars, and then basically put themselves in the Greek shoes, but as Jews. So all these so-called wars that the Jews was fighting is talking about in Genesis and everything like that, that supposedly the Jews was going out and conquering and fighting and everything. But when you go and look for that, you're going to see evidence of war, but not of the Jews. So as I showed you guys, it's really the Greeks talking about themselves and their wars and their battles that they had, along the way. This is what this is about. So when you get that aspect of it, it's still a lot of things that they have to explain and put in place. One of the major things will be, first of all, how is it that you had Hellenization going on, the Greeks going around, instilling all these beliefs and conquering everything. And basically, as I showed you with the wars of the Diadochi, how they divided up the land. So how we have this going on in Hellenization in process, but for some reason, these Jews are allowed to practice Judaism. What is that? So this is how you really start to pay attention and reveal what really took place. Because you have in ancient Kemet, we know when they took over, I showed you guys at the museum, Serapis, Zeus Ammon, and all these so-called Greek guys, that everything that they instill in Egypt to try to get the Egyptians to believe. But when you get down to Israel, for some reason, they say, okay, you know what? We're going to take over, but we're going to let the Jews keep the religion and keep following it. What's up with that? And then we know later on, they would follow it themselves. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense for all this to be going on. And then somehow, everybody, it's just Jews. Christians, everybody following this doctrine of a people that's conquered by a stronger people, supposedly. So when you start looking at it from this point, you can see what took place. But when you start to really know the history and everything behind it, it starts to basically show you the truth, and it makes a lot more sense. So now, as I said, I talked about how they had to go out and make these people. They had to go out and make sure that they can create Jews. They had to create these Hebrews to explain this history, as I talked about in the books of the Bible series. I talked about that in edited Exodus and Leviticus. So definitely you want to see those. But understand, you got to create these people. They had to explain a lot of this history because there is no proof. So if you're going to be trying to interject these people into history, you got to explain certain things that don't make sense. Now, when you're a person when you know about something and somebody comes and tries to talk about it, if you know everything about the situation, you can tell when they're lying. You can tell. It's like when somebody say they saw a movie and they can't really give you any parts of the movie. It's like, you ain't see that movie. Like, I can tell, I seen it. I don't know what you're talking about. So they have to try to cover for every single part. Every single scholar that's poking holes in the story is always a comeback. You ever see those real bad liars? They always got something, an excuse. They're always saying something to try to basically make up for their story sounding like bullshit. this is exactly what's happening with the antiquities of the Jews and their history. So it's a lot they have to explain and answer for. One of the things they got to explain, they have to tell us how, one, they was in Egypt in the 6th century BCE and how they disappeared. So first of all, one, you got to put yourself there and explain how are you there. And as I said, these people that are there are actually Greeks. And we're going to get into that in a second. But when you understand, when you start going back in history, how are you going to talk about one people and not the other, especially if this one group is supposed to be as glorious and huge as the Jews when you read the Old Testament. So when you have pharaohs and you have documentation of the Egyptians speaking of the Greeks and showing the Greeks, but no Jews, it's telling you, I mean, everything is giving you those connections right there that they were the Jews. That's who they're placing themselves to be. So they have to explain, one, how, because this is their claim, that the Babylonians came into Israel and basically took them into captivity into Babylon. Now, what they know is, they understand, and proof a show, that there were Assyrians. The Assyrians was coming into Kemet, and there was always these little wars and skirmishes between the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And the Assyrians would basically take over part of Lower Kemet. So this is them again trying to interject themselves during a period where there's war and stuff happen. Because then, it's chaos and stuff get lost, and you can't explain everything during the war because it's not going to be so much peace. It's just going to be remnants of a war. But there's other stories to be told that's basically destroyed and covered up by war. They understand this. So they want to interject themselves into this period of time and say, well, I guess during this time, the Babylonians came in and basically took them. Just for some reason, they ain't want no Egyptians. They wanted to, for some reason, just take the Hebrews and take them all the way back to Babylon, these grown-ass men and women, and just enslave them for whatever reason. So this is what they claim, because they have to basically answer for the fact that they're not there during this war. During this time, when you had Samtek I, who Herodotus talks about, know he exists. This is Egyptian pharaoh. During this time, when Samtek is basically fighting the Assyrians, we're the Jews. If y'all was there, where are y'all? Greeks was there, but there's no mention of no Jews. And I understand this. So when you read here, it's saying, now this is the military campaign of Samtek. It says Samtek won Egypt's independence from the Assyrian Empire and restored Egypt's prosperity during his 54-year reign. The pharaoh proceeded to establish close relation with archaic Greece. Telling you right there, that connection, we know that was there. The hieroglyphics and everything I talk about with them showing the depictions of white men being there. So we know the Greeks was there. And also encouraged many Greek settlers to establish colonies in Egypt and serve in the Egyptian army. In particular, he settled some Greeks at Taphnis. So now don't let the whole thing fool you about the Assyrians. Understand the Assyrians, when they talk about the Assyrian Empire, it also includes the Babylonians and the Sumer and the Akkadians. You have the Egyptians successfully defeating the Assyrians, which we would assume would include Sumer, the Babylonians, and the Akkadians. Now, if they can defeat these people, why would they have a hard time or basically lose in the conquest from the Babylonians? Because see, they want you to believe that the Babylonians came into ancient Kemet, defeated the Egyptians, the Babylonians alone. We know there's supposed to have been skirmishes and wars, civil wars in Mesopotamia between the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and the Babylonians supposed to have won. And you got to understand that whole thing when you start seeing Babylonians. Of course, somebody's talking about something biblical. Assyrians, they're talking about historical stuff, because that's what, the name that they use, and they try to really differentiate between the two. But mostly when you see Babylon, it's dealing with something biblical. They always throw that in there to give that reference, because the Bible's talking about, Babylon, the Babylonians. So, it's tough to believe that they was able to defeat them when the Egyptians had already beaten the Assyrians in a larger army. So now, Necho II, Egyptian pharaoh, son of Psamtik I, named after his father. He takes the throne 610 BCE. This is supposed to be around the time when the Babylonians come in and basically take the Egyptians out of Syria and out of Israel. So now it says here, Necho undertook a number of construction projects across his kingdom in his reign. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Necho II sent out an expedition of Phoenicians, as I talked about before in part one of ancient history. I told you guys the Phoenicians was there in Kemet. Plain and simple. They basically was the Egyptians. The Phoenicians, as I said, the purple people, name given by the Greeks, they were Egyptians. And there's other people who was basically there in Phoenicia to basically run that territory, because it's basically trade grounds. But it's telling you right here that he took the Phoenicians. These are Egyptians. It's just the name they used, the Greeks used, but they were down there, and they were, in Tyre, and we know Israel's along the way. They ruled Israel as well. This whole stretch of lands I talked about, ruled by ancient Egyptians. This is during the ancient Egyptian empire. They had control of this land. So it's saying Necho II set out an expedition of Phoenicians, which in 3 years sailed from the Red Sea around Africa to the mouth of the Nile. Now, this is the important part down here. They say Necho played a significant role in the histories of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the Kingdom of Judah. Because, of course, they're going to throw that bullcrap in there. This is bullshit. I'm going to tell you why. Necho II is most likely the pharaoh mentioned in several books of the Bible. They can say that with no proof. Where's the proof of that? So, where's his name? They don't want to mention no more names because they already messed up with Ramses. That was a monumental mistake, put Ramses' name in there, knowing it's not going to add up. But it's real easy for them to just come out and say, well, he's the pharaoh probably mentioned in the Bible, to try to fit them in there. That's what it's about. Giving you enough to make it seem like they're telling the truth and that this stuff fits when it's all bogus. They could say anything. Where's the proof to back it up? He had nothing to do with this kingdom. But what they do is, since they understand it was turmoil around this time, it's not so much you can do to find proof. They interject people in these places. And this is one of the things that's weird when they try to interject Jews in servitude of the Egyptians, as if they work side by side. So they give us Jehoiakim. It says here, Jehoiakim was appointed by King Necho II, king of Egypt, in 608 BC. After Necho's return from the Battle of Haran, 3 months after he had killed King Josiah at Megiddo. Now, Jehoiakim was supposedly king of Judah, Judea, however you want to pronounce it. He was the king there. So it's highly unlikely that the Egyptians, Necho II brought him in to basically rule while he was out at war. Why aren't y'all fighting alongside each other? What is he doing there? So again, this is they have to interject these people in to try to make it fit, to make it seem like, the Egyptians and the Greeks was just mingling in there together, but there's no proof of that. Plain and simple. They have to explain how they are in Israel during this time that the Egyptians are in power. And they're trying to make it like, well, they was in servitude to the Egyptians, basically working side by side. The Egyptians was appointing them to do stuff. But it's already giving you that hint when I was just explaining to you how you had, since they know, you had Psamtik and you had Necho basically getting the Greeks to work with them. That's documented. That's something we can prove from Herodotus and the Egyptians themselves that says and attests to the fact the Greeks and Egyptians was living alongside. Where is any mention of the Jews? So they had to put this in there. Well, it was the Egyptians, it was the Greeks and the Jews, but it's no mention of the Jews. But they got to explain for that. They have to explain that. They have to explain why and how they are there and in what capacity are they supposedly in Kemet during this time. There's no mention of them except for, bullshit like this. So now we're talking about the 6th century BCE. We know what's about to happen. We know eventually the Persians are going to come in there and take over Kemet from the Egyptians, right? So the whole question you have to ask yourself is, you have all these stories of the Jews in the Bible going out fighting these wars, conquering the whole nine. I just read to you how Necho II supposedly put a Jew in charge of basically running this area while he was out at war, giving you the hint that you had not only the Greeks working with the Egyptians, but the Jews as well in some capacity. So you would think there's a lot of them there. So the whole thing is, we know that the Persians came over. Now, according to the Jews, supposedly on their way to Kemet, to conquer Kemet, they stopped in Babylon, liberated the Jews. So they liberated the Jews, freed them, beat the Babylonians, came over to Israel, beat the Babylonians there. Now, maybe if it did really happen, which we know it didn't, maybe, you can say that the Persians told some of the Jews that, hey, we're going to Israel, whatever they called it back then, and go ahead and take that land from the Babylonians as well. Y'all should meet us up there, or what have you. But we don't know what the case was. But somehow, they made it up there. But the whole thing, again, is what you would have to explain. Well, there is no evidence or information that the Jews joined with the Persians to beat the Egyptians. They would like to have you believe that, so they can try to make it fit. Like, okay, well, maybe the Jews joined with the Persians since they freed them from Babylon and came out there and helped defeat the Egyptians. But that wouldn't make sense, because you would think they would have been strong enough to beat the Greeks, which they wasn't. So again, as I told you guys before, the whole thing with the Persians coming in was a whole setup by the Greeks in the first place. So we know we had this time. We're talking about the 6th century. The Greeks wouldn't come in and take over until around the 4th century. So around the 6th century, around 500 or something, you had this whole thing happen with the Persians coming in, taking over. You had the rebellion of the Egyptians fighting against the Persians for about 75 to 100 years. Then eventually, once they would regain power of Kemet, then the Greeks would take over. There is no mention of no Jews through none of this. And as I said, during this time, we know we had in Israel was black Egyptians. No Jews. There is absolutely no mention of them in history during this time, in this period. Because again, they got to explain, well, wait a minute. You had some king of Judea, basically ruling in Egyptian Pharaoh's place for a little bit till we came back. How wasn't y'all there to be documented in this war with the Persians in no way, shape, or form? And that's crazy. So they have to basically say, well, during this time, we was away, just got free from Babylon and what have you, or they wasn't there and we came up later after it was over, whatever they want to use. But it doesn't fit with actual history and what we can prove to the fact that we know the Persians came in there and took over and was having these battles. So the Egyptians was able to hold them off and keep them from gaining full control for a long time. As soon as they got full control, what happened? Greeks took over. Okay, so 4th century BCE, we know what's going on. We know the Greeks come in, take over from the Persians, right? They took over. Now you have the Greeks ruling. We know what happened with Alexander dying and the whole wars of the successors, the Diadoches, them basically splitting up the territories. So now the area, Judea, was basically ruled by the Seleucid Empire. And you have Antiochus IV running this thing when you get down to the 2nd century BCE. And, after the wars is basically starting to die down and you understand what was going on around this time, it was Hellenization. And this is the part that, they can't explain this part. There's no way they can really explain it. And the way they do explain it, it don't fit. How, again, everybody is falling under Greek rule. Hellenization is rampant, but for some reason, they are allowing these Jews to exist and do what they're doing. Now, when you start reading through the little stories about all this, they say little stuff like, they would allow the Jews to do certain things, but not really be spiritual about their religion. But they didn't give the Egyptians the same courtesy or anybody else the same courtesy. But somehow, some way, these Jews, who nobody's talking about, was able to exist, and not only exist, practice their religion. It's bogus. It's bogus. So you had Antiochus IV running this whole thing. And you have the Jews, from their history, basically talking about how Antiochus IV was basically mean to them and had all these rules and laws and treating them bad, and eventually they rebelled, which there's absolutely no documentation or proof of Antiochus IV doing anything bad to any Jews. Just that simple. There's no mention of this. There's no proof of that he was even that type of person. So this is where the whole story of Hanukkah comes into place, when you understand what happened in Judea. So you have with the whole story, this is where you have Judah, the Maccabee, and the whole story of Maccabees, where you have the Greeks basically take over the Jewish temple, and they're in there and they got pagan idols and all this stuff going on in there. Supposedly, according to the Jews, a lot of the Jews, this is where you see the whole Hellenized Jews, Jewish Hellenization. They want to sprinkle that in there to try to. It doesn't even make sense. It doesn't make sense for them to be creating these guys, and the whole purpose is Hellenization and getting people to convert and switch over to the beliefs and everything that the Greeks talk about, but allow the Jews to exist with their religion. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. Remember, around this time, it's the whole purpose of the Septuagint. Nobody's speaking Hebrew. They all speak in Greek. So if they would go as far as to have everybody speaking Greek, not really nobody speaking Hebrew, and if they would go that far, why would they allow them to practice this religion? Again, when I said the actions of the Greeks doesn't fit the letters of Orestes, and you're going to find out why later on. So, we know it's all bogus. So what supposedly happened is you had Judah the Maccabee and his brothers and a few other people, small army, basically supposedly go up against about 20 to 40,000 Greeks. And they fighting at the Jewish temple. And this small army of the Maccabees defeated the Greeks. Thousands of men, they just somehow defeated them. And it says here, the Maccabees were a group of Jewish rebel warriors who took control of Judea, which at the time was part of the Seleucid Empire. They founded the Hasmonean dynasty, which ruled from 167 BCE to 37 BCE, being a fully independent kingdom from about 110 to 63 BCE. They reasserted the Jewish religion, partly by forced conversion, expanded the boundaries of Judea by conquest, and reduced the influence of Hellenism and Hellenistic Judaism. Now, I wanted to highlight that part, by forced conversion. Let me tell you why. Because as I said, we know these were Africans there, black people. And there's evidence, there's already proof that there was people were forced into this religion, forced into Judaism. So they know when people go back and they start looking at this history, when they start seeing that, why are Jews supposedly forcing Jews to be Jews? Doesn't make sense. But when you understand, and as I said, what Hellenization really was them instilling the Jewish faith, because the Greeks created it. Was no Jewish people. They created the whole thing, and it was forcing it upon the African people that was there, the remnants of the Egyptian empire. Plain and simple. Doesn't that fit? It makes sense. As I said, they was ruling. Israel was their kingdom, the Egyptians. When the Persians came over, of course there was Egyptians still there, because we know they was fighting. And then when the Greeks came, still black Egyptians, Africans, whatever you want to call them, was there. They wasn't gone. They were converted. They tried to give them Zeus Amon, tried to give them Serapis. They wasn't having it. So Hellenization, the whole creation of this whole Jewish faith, was created and forced on them through generational indoctrination. That's basically how you do it. You start out with the kids. Plain and simple. When we teach the kids, they're going to grow up and teach their kids. And you make that system work like that. They had over 100 years to do it, people. They had plenty of time to get this thing going and get the people out spreading it. Plain and simple. So when you find proof that was forced, Jewish faith on people, this is what how they try to hide that fact. So how the story goes with Hanukkah is after they somehow defeated this huge army, and this little group defeated this huge army. They came into the temple. They seen the temple was destroyed and a bunch of pagan idols and stuff everywhere. And they basically wanted to light the menorah, which is basically like, you see a Hanukkah, the candles or whatever. But they only had enough oil to basically last them a day. And it would take them 8 days to sanctify the oil, to make the oil up or what have you. But somehow, miraculously, somehow through some kind of miracle, that oil that was only supposed to burn for 1 day burned for 8 days and gave them enough time to make more. And there you have Hanukkah. And they didn't really celebrate Hanukkah until that's a new American thing. Jews wasn't really celebrating Hanukkah until probably like the 1920s, when a lot of Jews was coming into America. But that story sounds more like a myth and a fable, when you understand. Now, of course, you're going to have those religious people that say, well, God was with them. God was with them and helped the oil burn, and God was with them to help them fight, this war. Now, all of that gives, a little bit more validity for them to the Bible when you say, when it's talking about in the Old Testament, how God was helping them fight all these wars against the Amalekites and the Girgashites and the Perishites and all that stuff like that. But in real history, where's these people? These names are not mentioned. But it gets people to say, well, maybe they just got the name mixed up. But we do have proof that this war happened, stuff like that, which, it's not no proof of this war with the Maccabees, no proof. So a lot of people say that. So what happened? You had Demetrius I Soter, who was basically nephew to Antiochus IV. He basically escaped or, left Rome without the permission of the Romans, came into Judea and basically crowned, or Jerusalem or what have you, basically crowned himself king. He said, I'm the rightful king. I'm supposed to be on this throne, and I'm basically going to go kill them damn Maccabees. Now, while this is going on and they're getting their men together, what have you, the Jews were smart. They understood that eventually, Rome would take over. Rome was pulling the strings. And that, the Romans was basically, behind the Greeks, and the Greeks was messing up. They couldn't stop fighting each other, and the Romans would eventually take over. And they went, you had Judah, the Maccabee, and they basically went and signed a treaty with Rome to basically, smooth everything out. Say, I know y'all gonna take this shit over. We might as well be cool with y'all. But Demetrius I didn't care about none of that. He basically got his men together. He went there and supposedly brought, a bunch of dudes. Now, remember, they just had fought and defeated like 20 to 40,000 men, beat them easily, according to their story. But somehow the men this time said, well, it's too many of them. Let's get out of here. This is their story. It's too many of them. We can't beat all these men. No, let's go. But you miraculously just did this. You just defeated them before, supposedly with God's help. And God going to be with you. Where's the faith? No faith this time. They said, hey, this is how they try to make the story make sense. Hey, it's too many people. Let's get out of here. We can't beat these guys. So they told Judah, the Maccabee, to basically leave. We outnumbered. He stayed. Some men stayed. They got slaughtered. So I guess God wasn't with them that battle. They got beaten, and that was the end. Maccabees lost. Judah the Maccabee was killed, and basically, the Greeks took back power, and that's basically what happened. So it's cool that they put a little story together to get people hype about that time, to try to interject them into history. Yeah, we did take over. We won and we defeated this huge army, but they took it back. It takes away the specialness of Hanukkah when you really pay attention to that. It makes it all bullshit, which I believe a lot of Jews believe it was bullshit, which is why they didn't really adopt the whole thing in the beginning. It's more of an American thing, which is why everybody comes together and talks about Hanukkah. But when you really get into the story, it don't fit. It doesn't make sense. And there's no proof of it, by the way. But, they put that in there. And the whole part about them having this special, making them seem like they had divine powers and was divinely willed or, skill to basically fight off these Greeks who were huge. Plain and simple, huge. We know the Greeks pride themselves on, being strong warriors. Sparta is basically an acronym, for sports, where we get sports from. Sparta was about sports. It was about big, strong dudes and the Olympics and all that stuff like that. So to have these Jews be able to defeat thousands of them with their, small numbers, it's crazy. Maccabees, well, it's an acronym for who is amongst the strong like God. Sounds like something, some Greeks to make up anyway. But we know, okay, Greeks got back power. Eventually, the Romans would take over, and the Romans would be in power. They would put Herod basically as king of Judea. And then you have the whole Josephus coming into play. And Josephus, when he's talking about the antiquities of the Jews and the wars of the Jews, he gets into the whole thing with Hanukkah and all that stuff like that. All bullshit. But this is where you have Josephus come in, start talking about, this period where the Jews rebel or revolt against the Romans, and they basically, the Romans burn down the Jewish temple, and the only thing that's left standing is, the Western Wall. And this is the wall I always talk about, where all the celebrities go, the so-called Wailing Wall. They go to the wall. Everybody goes to the wall. What's supposed to be the last remnants of the Second Temple. Now, my whole thing is, still no proof of that any of these temples was built. And another thing is, if the entire temple went up in flames, whatever was made of, it looked like it was made of the same stuff as the wall. So you would think, man, if this wall is still here, still standing, still strong, that the rest of the temple would have been standing as well. But they can go there and point to any wall that was built that's high, that looks, amazing, and say, well, this was the wall. Here's the proof that the temple was here, it was burnt down, and this is the Wailing Wall, and everybody comes there, and then, this is why they go to that wall. So now you understand what that's about. It has to do with the whole war of the Jews against the Romans. And it's weird because they did have that treaty, and supposedly the Romans wasn't treating them bad. Who knows what happened? Again, it's a whole nother question you still got to look at, is why would the Romans allow them to come and keep this religion? Remember, another thing, the Romans kept Hellenization going when they took over. So why is these Jews getting this courtesy? What's going on? And then we know eventually they would basically adopt, the laws, the religion. If you take in Christianity, you accept in Judaism as well. Plain and simple. So it's weird, but this is why they go to that wall. And this is where Josephus comes in and basically starts to give us, because we're getting into Christianity now around this time. The whole war happened, or what have you. And eventually, the Jews will be, set free and loose or what have you. And we know for 300 years before that, they was following Greek manuscripts of the Hebrew law. No Hebrew. So, and this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls supposed to have come in and all that whole stuff. We'll get into that, but we know it's bogus. But Josephus will basically give us the whole Testimonium Flavianum, which basically is the golden paragraph, they call it, where he's basically backing up, Jesus Christ, saying, he was there around this time. He was born like 10 years or so after Jesus, and he's been around and got stories from the people and all this stuff, supposedly giving validity to Jesus Christ. A lot of people always talk about this, but we're going to bust that in a second. So anybody who really studies the whole thing already knows that it's already suspect for Josephus to be talking about Christians, since nobody else is talking about Christians around this time. You had the time when it was talking about the Messiah, Christ and all that. And you had supposedly the Hellenized Jews starting to, convert over. Not convert, but basically accept it. Because even the people who accepted Christ, they were still called Jews. And you had the Tanaim, which is basically the teachers, the Jewish teachers, that had basically created laws that forbid the Jews who stayed with regular Judaism to do business with the Jews who was accepting of the Messiah. So you had that going on. They even had their, morning prayers or what have you modified so they can basically say a curse to the people who thought differently, the Jews who basically switched. But it was nobody talking about Christians around this time. Wasn't no Christian groups. So to have documentation supposedly from Josephus, which Josephus himself is still a mystery if he really exists. A lot of people believe it's a writing name for somebody else, one of the Pisos. But to have that is crazy. So now it says here also the final assertion that Christians were not extinct at this day, because it's something that they said was no Christians, confirms that the so-called testimonium is a later interpolation. How much later we cannot say, but there is no tribe of Christians during Josephus' lifetime. Christianity under that moniker did not establish itself until the 2nd century outside of this single bogus paragraph, which is the golden paragraph I talked about. In all the extensive histories of Josephus, there is not a single reference to Christianity anywhere. So what you have happen is around this time, leading up to the whole council or what have you, had Eusebius. That's why they had the whole Eusebius canon or what have you, because it's basically stuff that he came up with. So the first person to basically mention this whole golden verse about, Josephus giving validity to Jesus is Eusebius. So Eusebius is the person who came out of nowhere. Hey, Josephus said this. And he's the only person to ever mention it and the first person to say anything about it. Whoever smelled it, dealt it. There it is. But also, it is Eusebius who gave us the letters of Orestes. He just so happened to have a copy of the 160 BCE letters of Orestes that he brought out and supposedly attributes to Josephus talking about it as well to try to give validity to the document, saying that, it was true. So you have the same person who's given us this whole story of the supposed validity of Jesus, giving us the letters of Orestes, which nobody believes is real. And it can't be backed up. None of it can be proven. And that's really what you get into with all of this, is being able to prove what's being said. And this is what's going on. When you go back and you start looking through that history, you see what they're doing, what exactly is happening. It's them trying to give validity and establish themselves in antiquity, to put themselves in places of history where they know is actually real history. Now, if you have this history happening under the Greeks and the Romans, the same two people who was behind and running the whole show, it's easy for them to put their people in place, their archaeologists and their researchers and scientists in place, because it's their country, they're running it, to say this stuff is valid and put out the whole word and be the authority on the word and the history of biblical religion. So they can come out and say, this was true, this is real, this happened, and people just buy it hook, line, and sinker. And this is what has been happening, but it's no proof. So now, even with the letters of Orestes, it's saying it's a Hellenistic work of the 2nd century BCE assigned by biblical scholars to the pseudepigrapher Josephus, who paraphrases about 2/5 of the letter, ascribes it to Orestes, and to have been written to a certain Philocrates, which Philocrates is supposed to be the brother of Orestes. He is a politician, describing the Greek translation of the Hebrew law by 72 interpreters sent to Egypt from Jerusalem at the request of the librarian of Alexandria. And of course, we know this librarian in Alexandria was supposedly told by Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So we're saying resulting in the Septuagint translation. Understand that. Though some have argued that its story of the creation of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is fictitious. It is the earliest text to mention the Library of Alexandria. So understand this, people. And it's one of the reasons I had to put this in here. It's telling you that the letters of Orestes is the earliest text to mention the Library of Alexandria. Now, we talk about this all the time. Oh, the Library of Alexandria. There's no proof. There's no proof of it. And if this letter is bogus, then it's possible that the library was bogus. And it's possible that since they give us the story that they just somehow put all the ancient Egyptian manuscripts, all the paperwork, everything they stole from Kemet, all that paperwork in the Library of Alexandria, that somehow burnt to the ground. Burnt to the ground. This is the earliest mention ever. We're talking about the 2nd century BCE. So before the 2nd century BCE, we ain't got no mention of the Library of Alexandria, which should have been established between the 4th century and, when it was burned down. So it should have been built in the 4th century at least, or it could have been an existing building there. But either way, there is no mention until the 2nd century BCE. So did it exist or not? did it exist or not? So if it's no mention, that means Herodotus never talked about it. He never talked about it. So we know that was before, he died before the conquest of Alexander, but he never spoke of no great library that the Egyptians had as well, to where they would have a bunch of, such documents. But we know that it was, named after Alexander, and supposedly when they conquered, they hid all this documentation in there of the Egyptians and the place burnt down. It's come on. There's no way in the world they would be that careless with that much, really important evidence, really important papers. So suffice it to say that they probably have it. Everybody talks about the Vatican vaults and, their libraries, what have you. Who knows what they have? Who knows? As I keep telling people, they would not have left Egypt to be buried in the sand if they could not read the metal netter, if they couldn't read the hieroglyphs, if they didn't get everything they was looking for, all of the information. They got it. They got it. And they still have it. Who knows where it is? But I know it exists. And I had this little debate with somebody about the library, and I was like, we don't even know. And I don't think they would be careless enough to let that stuff burn up. All of it just gone, everything gone, all of it. Nothing survived. It's tough to believe. So when you get into that, getting up to, Christianity coming into play and seeing where all this stuff is starting to fall into place, goes right into Constantine, goes right into the pagans, basically getting they stuff together and understanding how powerful this whole Christianity thing is going to be and setting up this plan. Eusebius clearly on board and pushing all this, biblical stuff to be put in place. And, this is where they begin with, the whole Christianity thing. But there had to be that separation with Judaism. See, this is the history that they don't give you guys, that they don't talk about. You have a lot of history books getting to a lot of this information, but skipping key parts and key points. It's one of the things I see a lot, and a lot of people fall victim to, is when somebody's given a story that a lot of people really just let their common sense walk out the door and just believe what people say because they think somebody's smarter than them or because they sound smart. I always give you guys pictures and I always post things to, give you guys proof to what I'm saying, because in this day and age, I don't expect people to believe everything I say or believe everything someone says, especially when it's stuff like this, when it's ancient and it's far-fetched information. Sometimes you got to provide as much proof as possible. But when people give you this stuff and it's just completely out of whack, I mean, your common sense has to kick in and say, something is up, I got to look deeper into this. But this is the history that they really hide, really, stemming from the fall of Kemet, where when we pay attention, we go back in history, it just seems like everything starts from there. Because the people, remember, history is told by the conquerors, not the conquered. So why does it seem like history just stops at Kemet? Because we was in power before Kemet up to the fall of Kemet. Plain and simple, we was in power. They took over at the fall of Kemet and they began their conquest ever since then. That's all they know. That's all they can tell us. That's all they're going to tell us, because they don't want to tell us about what we did and what was really going on. So when you begin to follow the story, their story, and you can see how bogus it is. You can poke holes in it, just like their own people are, plain and simple. So not everybody is on board with what these scholars are saying, but these scholars are getting a check from an institution, from a school, or some kind of government facility to keep this narrative going, to suppress the real history of us, plain and simple. So this is important to know. And, I really appreciate a lot of people making the Ancient History series popular. A lot of people have been buying the DVDs and really getting into it. But this is that gap that you got to get, that's stemming from the fall of Kemet up to Christianity and its power and its height, going through Rome and going through, Europe, until eventually coming to America, to here. But this is where all of the work came into play, right here between this time. So, we talked about in the first one with Alexander and everything that was happening, and how we can see clearly when it's talking about the whole wars down there and down in Tyre, that it's not talking about the biblical Tyre. It's talking about actual Tyre, which you got to really separate. And they basically going to use that name, of course, because they know it's a real place. But what it's saying in the Bible is not really what happened. We know it's talking about Alexander. And that whole story right there, how I broke that down in part 1, I mean, that's enough to see the type of stuff that they do. It's a parable. It's giving you a different story. And it's not a coincidence that the people that's involved with that war just so happen to be, what Nebuchadnezzar saw. It's giving you a hint and insight into the people you need to be paying attention to. Main people, of course, would be the Greeks, plain and simple. And the Romans, which, to us is white is white. Now, you can say that they're the same, or that, they came together and decided to join forces with the whole Greco-Roman thing and just be like, we all white, let's be in on this. Who knows? But we know it's all suspect, it's all bogus, the history behind their rise and what was really taking place. Hellenization was not Hellenization. Hellenization was the creation and the indoctrination of this Jewish faith, this whole Judaism thing that wasn't even the way we know it today. It was something completely different, having to do with sacrifices, with lambs and everything like that. So now, what I talked about, and I probably showed you in a video on YouTube, is really paying attention to, as I showed you guys in Bloody Leviticus, how the Greeks were basically the ones who was doing all the sacrificing, and everything that we see that they're following in Leviticus, supposedly be the Jews, is what the Greeks was doing with the sacrifices. When I posted those preview videos on YouTube, I was talking to my group and telling you guys to basically look at what is it called? Troy on Netflix, where you have the Black Achilles or what have you, was basically showing you in that whole movie, in that series, the Greeks doing exactly what I said they did. And that was the sacrifices, the burnt offerings. There it is. Giving you that hint right there, that proof right there, that this is what they was doing. Plain and simple. Now, we don't see videos like that for Jews. We don't see that stuff. We see it for the Greeks, and we see that they're doing exactly what the Bible says the Jews was doing. That's not a coincidence. Now, as we keep going through history, it's not a coincidence we keep finding the Greeks, talk about the whole wars of the Diadochi again, and how they were spreading Hellenization, and how the Romans, who are also, giving us biblical history, just so happen to be the ones who take over the reign. And, the Greeks kind of sort of fade out, and you start hearing about the Romans. And then during this time of the rise of Christianity, there's not much from the Greeks at all. What's going on with the Greeks during this time frame when Christianity is at its rise? Did they assimilate into the Roman Empire? What's really happening? It's not much being put out about it, but we understand, both the New Testament is in Greek, so they have something to do with it. And we know everybody was reading Greek and speaking Greek around this time. So when you get up to the point of Josephus and everything that's happening there, it's still no real validity for the Old Testament. You have the whole thing with the Septuagint and the letters of Orestes basically looking bogus. And as I said, it's basically poof out of nowhere. The Greeks give us the Septuagint. Here's this book, the Septuagint, and it's supposedly, the Hebrew law. Bullshit. And it's, if you are and have been allowing these Jews to exist and practice this religion for hundreds of years by this point, you don't have no book. You don't know what they're talking about. You don't know their doctrine. Think about that. If you're ruling over a people who are to themselves and have these rituals or what have you, wouldn't you want to know what they're talking about, what it's all about, what kind of intel or intelligence type people you have, what kind of leaders or military leaders would go to war with the people who don't know what they're talking about? It is highly unlikely. It's highly unlikely that they will wait till, the second century, BCE or what have you, to finally understand what they're talking about. I want a Greek translation. I want to know what y'all talking about. What is the Hebrew law after all this time? So it's suspect. It's real suspect. And again, the biggest part is how, after all that, all the wars, everything that has happened, that the Greeks and the Romans find themselves in bed with the Jews. having the oldest Jewish synagogue in Delos in Greece, and the Greek people converting. You had all this Hellenization supposedly going on, but all of a sudden, the Greeks are Christians, the Greeks are Jews, the Romans, Catholics, which is basically Christians. All of them conform to what the Jews have been doing. It does not fit them allowing Judaism to exist, then all of a sudden assimilating their people into that culture. When you have, the Romans clearly following the Greeks and the Greeks stealing from the Egyptians, but they're going to take Judaism and Christianity. It don't make sense. Only thing that fits is that they created it, plain and simple. It's the only thing that goes there. And you got to pay attention and look at that and see that that's exactly what it is. So when you get to Josephus, that whole story, him being a Judeo-Roman scholar, a traitor, you might as well say. Now, supposedly, remember the whole story when before they catch Josephus, Joseph ben Medatayu, I think that was his original name, that he committed suicide. A bunch of people committed suicide, but he somehow survived. A lot of people was committing suicide instead of being taken, but he somehow survived suicide and was basically held captive. And they make you believe that he was forced to tell all the secrets to the Romans. And he eventually changed his name, Titus, Flavius, Josephus, and all that bullshit. We understand all that, but he was a traitor to his people when you really pay attention to it. So why would you believe his word that this dude's a traitor and he's supposed to be Jewish? And you can look at it that way and say, well, that's why he's giving validity to Jesus because it's a Roman thing. But for him to have stuck, first of all, you're about to kill yourself to not be captured, but then you allow yourself to be captured and be converted over. It just don't make sense. It seems like the dude would rather have died like his people did. But not only does he convert over and gives validity to Jesus, but he gives this is the singular so-called proof or so-called, testimonium, what they call it, to back up the validity of Christ from this single source, which is Josephus coming from Eusebius, who we can't trust nothing he say. He's known as a liar. So you got to look at that. The dude was a traitor, plain and simple, traded on his people. Why should anybody trust his word and what he's saying? It doesn't fit. So you have the whole thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls coming up. And around this time, you can say they hit him during the whole Jewish war with the Romans. But there's a lot of speculation surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls and the fact that, they're in pieces. And people say that the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't go with what Jesus and what the people basically practiced around that time. And to me, I think what's in there is completely different. It applied to the people at that time, and it doesn't fit with these biblical books that, the Jews use to this day, or the Christians. I think it's something totally different. And that's basically what it is. So this is why they haven't revealed the whole thing to us. But all of it is suspect. It's all bogus, leading up to the so-called Council of Nicaea, giving us the Christian doctrine and all these laws from Constantine. All this stuff goes together. It's that whole history, backtracking from the fall of Kemet to the rise of Christianity and the European powers. So it's hard for a lot of people to believe that it's the Greeks, that it was the Greeks, because a lot of us we were more into, Christianity than Judaism, not looking at the past, not looking back far enough, looking at Christianity and stopping, with the Roman Empire, and not really going back into antiquity, not understanding who Josephus was and all the stories and everything that came, with the whole so-called rise of the Jews. And we go to the Bible for that. But to validate that stuff, we got to look at history, and you can't validate it. So a lot of people just can't fathom. When I talk about this stuff a lot, read a lot of the comments on YouTube, talk to a lot of people, they just can't grasp the Greeks, until I break it down. And then people will look at it differently. It's not too many people out there that's really putting out the information and pointing the finger to the Greeks to get them to see that they played a huge part. Not played a huge part, they created Judaism, plain and simple. I showed you guys Hebrew is Greek, It's out of, print at the moment. But last I checked, the book was like at $7,000, but it's out of print. So clearly they jacked up the price. Probably got a lot of people to sell their books, or they probably bought a lot of books. They're trying to get rid of those books because he proves his point that not only Hebrew comes from Greek, but also Arabic. And it gives us the tie to Islam to show us that all this stuff was created by the same people for the same purpose. You just got to tie it together. And this is what people are not doing, because a lot of people don't care. This series like this is for the true scholar, for the people who's trying to really get all the information and, be knowledgeable about it. Now, I encourage everybody to always go ahead and research what I talk about and, do your own research to back up, my claims, to look at my claims. And for the most part, people do. But, it's right there. You'll see it. A lot of people are not really going to be into this information. But when you find yourself into a conversation with somebody about the antiquity of the Jews and what happened with Kemet and everything that happened after that, this is crucial information, plain and simple, because you can see how it played out and you can prove it. You can prove it. So, by the fact that you have, of course, free historians and people who thought for themselves and wasn't under control, people who wrote about so many different things, and just the simple fact that they have to be somewhat true to the history. They have to tell it, because when you have people go in and do the research independently, if it comes out way different, then people are going to be looking at it funny, like, why would you lie about this stuff? But when you can tell it in a way that, some subtle things might not be able to be validated, but, it's possible, then it gives sort of validity to the lie. And you can say, well, it's possible this could have happened because we have information about this war. Some kind of fight happened here. So what you guys are saying is possible. And this is how they play. This is what they're doing. But, I don't want people to think that they have it all laid out, because they had criticism. They had people going up against them, their own people. They couldn't just really come out and say to their people exactly what their agenda was and what they was doing. So, you can bribe some people, you can kill some people, but then it make other people look more harder at what they was working on. So that's always something you got to really deal with. And people who follow research and people who really dig deeper because somebody passed. And it's always that, aspect to it. So this is a very fine line they walked. And I'm going to tell you without, question, it's amazing. It's amazing. And these people are smart. They know what they're doing. Like, when you follow this stuff, and you see how they put this stuff in place. I mean, they back up their lies, but they leave enough there to get people to know, the insiders to know, this is not true. This is what this really is. And that's how they do it. So, regular person going to read it, take it straight forward, but they leave that little bit in there for people who are, I guess, secret society or what have you, to be able to pull out the truth and be like, okay, so this is bullshit. This is what really happened. Plain and simple. So if you're following the true history and then reading the Bible, you can pull it out. That's why I said the Bible is the key. You have to read it, because then when you follow that, then look at the true history, you can put it together. You can put it together and see exactly what they're talking about and what they're pointing to. And you can see clearly they point to themselves. Just that simple. They point to themselves and saying, we the ones who did this. This is what we're doing. And that's what happened. And this is what they're doing. So the Roman influence, because it's tough for you to gauge who is exactly on top, seemingly the Jews. I mean, and you would think if they was the ones who established this whole thing from the beginning, but even though they was Greeks, that they would be the ones in power, but we know the Romans took over. We don't really know what happened. We don't even know if they're the same people. We don't know what's going on. But seemingly the Jews are in power. Some people would say Rome. But you have in these royal families, the Rothschilds or what have you, them being Jews. And that the Rothschilds' plan was to come out and say that they are the descendants of Jesus Christ. All that stuff is there. And then if they wanted to, the royal family, the Saudi royal family, can piggyback and say, we the descendants of fucking Abraham. Ur the Chaldees. You know what I'm saying? We descendants of him. We royal. You know, all that stuff is there. And who knows, they might do it in some later future. Who knows what they're going to do. But it's all there, and they have it laid out correctly. It's only going to take one of them or somebody who's really into this information to be able to pull out the truth. And this is what the whole series is about with ancient history, which is a lot more to get into, a lot more things we got to look into, you know, with now the Roman Empire, because now at this point, the Greeks are basically, they're done. And it basically converts to this Roman Empire, this Holy Roman Empire that's going to be huge moving forward. And we see, as I talked about, how they allowed now the Arabs to come in to, you know, Israel, mix with them, mix with the Greeks, and basically come into and take over Kemet, Egypt, from the Romans. So it's like the Greeks are like, okay, let them have that. We come in with the Romans, and then, you know, they move forward. Because now, you know, at this point, everything is done. They have, you know, the territories taken over that they needed. They have the might and the money that they needed. So now they have to go forward and start to give validity to this doctrine. And they begin to set up the steps for that. This is what Rome was doing. You know, meanwhile, dealing with this whole battle with the damn Arabs. And not only that, you know, also fighting the Africans, fighting us in Africa and Northern Africa during this time, trying to take over those territories, which they was already in little pockets. But then now you had them with joining with the Arabs, and talked about this in the whole Moors DVD, how they basically used them to go in there and conquer Northern Africa, which they're now trying to basically change completely, you know, white. So this is what's going on around this time. After it's all said and done, they have this time. They basically assimilated the Greeks into Roman culture and allowed Greece to be, you know, half and half or what have you. And, you know, eventually they went to go set up their, you know, base of operation now, which we would say is Israel, giving all this money to them. And it seems like these families is running everything. So this is where it's going back to. But there's a lot more to it that you got to get and understanding who these people are and what they have been doing and continue to do, you know, on this planet. So can't ignore this history. You know, it's a lot we got to dig more into with the Moors and with the Knights Templar. That's another huge thing we're going to get into in the next part. So when you step back and look at the whole thing, it's tough to deal with because we're talking about, you know, a long time span, thousands of years. And it's like, who is these people? You know, who are they to be able to begin this whole thing BCE and still have the drive and the will and the want to, and, you know, be able to pass down the knowledge, the information for them to keep going, you know, for over 2,000 years. And that's what people don't put together. They don't put together those pieces. So it's the same thing with the Hebrews looking at the Old Testament saying that Moses wrote it. So Deuteronomy is over 2,000 years old or what have you. And it's talking about black slavery in America. It's a prophecy, not realizing that King James Version, as I said, 1604, 1611, and that this stuff is written later. And they can't fathom, you know, to be able to trace back the people behind Deuteronomy from, you know, when it started all the way up until, you know, King James time, and that these would be the same people possibly, you know, putting out the same lie, the same story. A lot of people can't fathom this stuff. That is so old and there's so many people behind it, so much power. How is these people seemingly alive and still able to continue something they started 2,000 years ago? So, you know, that is definitely one of the things that bothered me in all of this, you know, just really trying to understand, you know, how these people was able to do this so long. And it's something that tricks you in your research. It's one of the main reasons why I do this series. I wanted to put this out and why I put out a lot of videos, because, you know, doing your research, you're going to run into this stuff. And it's going to be a lot of things that people are going to just pass on because it doesn't fit. And one of the reasons it doesn't fit is because it's hard to fathom that these people have been around so long. It just doesn't make sense. If I'm rich, super famous, forget fame, power, rich, plain and simple, I'm chilling, you know. It's like, you only got this life to live. Why do you want to spend your entire life and dedicate your entire life to what? To some plan that you're never going to see come into play. It's like, who would do that? So it's like these people following this plan and everything. Why would they put their whole entire life behind this and they're not going to live to see it? So it's something you got to think about. Like, why would they do that? You know, it doesn't make sense. And what's the point? Why? You know, why be so evil when you can have anything you want? And, you know, people are not trying to hurt you. Africans, we never attacked anybody. We never tried to take anybody's territory. So it's like, what is the point of all this? So it's tough for a lot of people to fathom this kind of information and to go back and look and see how old it is and how it's all connected up to this day. And the fact that, you know, this stuff is here. These people exist. They still exist, you know. And how far back do they go? How old are they? What do they know that we don't know? What's really going on? Why are these people helping them? That's regular humans. Do they not know what they're doing, what they're trying to do, or what they want? What is what they want? What's going on? Because you got to think and look at these people who are, you know, helping them out. Why not speak out? Why not try to get everybody on board? Why not reveal who these people are and what's going on? It's something deeper than we understand. It's something much more powerful going on that we can't comprehend. And these people are either acting out of fear or because, you know, the truth is something that they can't, you know, deal with. Something that we can't deal with. Something that they know they can't beat or we can never beat as a people as a whole. We don't know. But from looking at everything and being doing this research for over 16 years now, it seems to me, you know, they're very cautious in how they move and what they do. That denotes, that shows fear, worry about something, you know. And as I talked about with us, them understanding what's possible with African people if we woke up, you know, they're keeping their foot on our throat and they're not allowing us to move an inch, you know. And when you start to trace this back, and it goes back so far, it's tough to believe it's the same people. But it is. There's no way around that. It's what the proof shows. All these monarchies and kings all in on it. All these presidents and people that's in power. Every leader is in on this thing. These so-called battles y'all think going on with North Korea and we at war against each other, it's bullshit. Same thing with Russia. It's bullshit. The answering to the same people is all WWE. It's all staged. It's all to control the masses. And it makes you really wonder, why would they be in on this big global scam? What is it all about? It's crazy. It's mind-boggling. So it gets so deep to a lot of people where they don't want to deal with the information no more. And I have had a lot of people, you know, become conscious and start getting into the information. They just can't deal with it. They can't handle it. They want to go back to regular, normal life and leave the stuff alone. And I was at that point. You know, at one point I wanted to just say, you know what, I just want to be regular and just fucking go and work and just, you know, have fun to make money or what have you. And, you know, it's tough to do. It's tough to do when you see what's going on. When you try to watch TV, but you see all the symbolism and everything. It's tough to just deal with that when you got this information in your head and you know what's happening. And it's like you want to do something about it. It's like normal good. You know, it's like normal, like what should be, which gives me the hope that there is good out there, that there is something good that we're supposed to follow. It's what's right, and that somehow whoever this powers that be is took hold of that. They jacked it somehow, some way. It's like this good. It's not something that can be really programmed into you. You know what I'm saying? It's like something that you know. We just feel it, like, you know, without being told that this is right, this is wrong. We feel that normally. And it could be from, you know, past experiences here, what have you, but it's something that feels natural, that there's a natural good or order to things that should be, you know, honored. And they are against that. So it's deep. But don't want to go too much deeper into it. It's a lot more to come. Want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch and support and purchase and really you know, sent a lot of questions about the series. A lot of people like it, the type of information. A lot of people wanted the information to fill that gap from the fall of Kemet up into the rise of the church. And here it is. And here it is. So it's a lot more that comes into play with Rome, the Arabs and slavery up until, full slavery and the rise of the European Church, the Church of England, and everything that happened with that. And it's a lot to get into. So we're going to get into those things and really continue to build onto the series. But I want to thank you guys again, taking the time to watch and purchase and support. See you guys next video. And thanks for watching.